I think we're going to start, even though we know that there will be people battling their way up the hill in the rain. Greetings from not-so-sunny LA today. I'm Marcia Reed. I'm the chief curator at the Research Institute, and I'm proud to say that for almost 30 years now at the Research Institute, we've been collecting archives that document the history of art from all periods. Most recently, though, we've focused on developments in the post-war era around the Los Angeles region. Tom Crow, our next to last director, called it the things that were right on our doorstep. The project took off in 2006 with the On the Record project. It was a joint initiative by the Research Institute and the Getty Foundation to collect or to produce oral histories of the period and to help to preserve original materials, both institutional and personal archives. Like our sister institution, and we're very, very grateful to have members of the staff of the Archives of American Art here and to follow up on a 2000 workshop that we did. We hope that we'll do it a little bit sooner next time. Shouldn't take 10 years, I don't think. But we realized that facets of the recent history of LA were quickly disappearing. Key figures were becoming senior citizens, downsizing studios and offices, and households were being dispersed. Papers were occasionally very sadly discarded because of very poor storage conditions. They just got moldy and fell apart. At the same time, however, there was increasing recognition that in the post-war period, Los Angeles had become a center for artistic innovation and creative energy, attracting artists from all over the world, sending its artists around the world to participate in major exhibitions such as Documenta. The situation cried out for an assessment and a marshaling of resources. And the On the Record, Art in LA from 1945 to 80, was the first phase, a major survey of architectural holdings, which called for collections preservation. The second phase began the process of organization and preservation of the materials with awards from the Getty Foundation to libraries, archives, and museums, including the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, UCLA, Otis, Art Center, College of Design, among many, many others. The public was engaged in an ongoing, really lively, I love them, series of public panels with artists such as Fred Hammersley, George Herms, Ed Ruscha, curators Henry Hopkins, Walter Hopps, James Burns, gallerists Virginia Dwan, Irving Blum, collectors Stanley Grinstein, and just general LA sort of people around the landscape, Sid Felsen of Gemini GEL. The third phase of this project appears to extend beyond anybody's lifetime. It's really great. It's barreling along now. We opened more than 60 exhibitions for Pacific Standard Time this fall. They'll go through the winter and the spring. And then some of them are going to travel. Ours are going to Berlin. And the really wonderful ASCO survey, which is at LACMA now, is going to go to Williams College in the Berkshires. It's a really interesting place for it to move on to. With today's event, the momentum is continuing. We're especially proud, as I said, to have the Archives of American Art here working with us. They are the preeminent repository of original documents on the history of art in America. Our archives are small potatoes compared to theirs. And they're collaborating with us on this program, and we hope on some future programs. So please turn off your cell phones. Make sure your watches are set to Pacific Standard Time. And I'm going to introduce John Tain and also Liza Kirwin to start the program.
Thank you, Marcia, for that introduction. So I'm John Tain, a curator for the Modern and Contemporary Collections here at the Getty Research Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Artists and Archive Symposium on this rather, unfortunately, rainy California day. I'm glad you could make it, fight it through the traffic and the parking lot to get up here. The impetus for this symposium has to do with, of course, as you know now, Pacific Standard Time, the initiative looking at the history of Southern California art from 1945 to 1980. But, and of course, it coincides with the exhibitions here, both Cross Currents in the Special Exhibitions Gallery in the museum and the Greetings from LA exhibition at the GRI Gallery in the Round Building, in case you're not familiar with the geography here. And I encourage you to visit both exhibitions, as well as the Dwayne Valentine exhibition, Dwayne Valentine's Gray Column, and the photography exhibition that will be opening in December. But I'd like to give a little back history of this. I think the original kernel for the idea for some kind of event having to do with this actually springs from yet another conference that took place in Dallas, actually, I think it was, in 2008 at College Art Association, when Liza and I first met at a panel that was sponsored by the ASAP project, looking at institutionalizing the archives of avant-garde artists and what that meant. And one of the things that emerged from that conversation, I think, was the idea that, archives are not just something that kind of once created kind of then get deposited, but actually continue living. And one of the ways they live is through the uses that are made of them, and that includes the uses that artists make of archives and the work of other artists. And so I'm glad that today we could invite three distinct, very different artists to talk about the way that archives and archival impulses impact their artistic practice. George Herms, Suzanne Lacy, and Mario Garcia Torres. In the interest of keeping things short, I'm going to turn things over to Liza Kirwin now, and she will introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, John. Another thread of origins for today's program was a symposium that the Archives co-sponsored with the PhD program in art history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in 2008, called Contemporary Art in the Archive. It generated a lot of good discussion in New York, and we wanted to take it to the West Coast, so thankfully John Tain was interested and shaped this idea to complement the current Pacific Standard Time programming. And I want to thank John and the Getty Research Institute for taking this on, and also thank Jennifer Schmidt at the GRI and Jennifer Baker Howard on our end for all of their expert assistance. Since 1973, the Archives of American Art has had a sustained commitment to documenting the history of art in California by preserving the papers of Wallace Berman, Fred Hammersley, Jay DeFeo, Hassel Smith, Beatrice Wood, and hundreds of other collections, as well as producing oral history interviews for decades. The Archives has promoted California art in the broader context of American art. Getty's PSD initiative is an outstanding model of collaboration and discovery that will have a profound effect on scholarship. And while I've only had one day in Los Angeles, I was able to see a few of the exhibitions in the staggering array of PST projects, and I highly recommend the exhibition, Doing It in Public, I guess, Feminism and Art at the Women's Building, now at the Otis College of Art and Design. This is an exhibition where archives take center stage to bring the past sharply into the present. Who could have imagined even 30 years ago that the concept of the archive would become so central to current art practice? As an organizing principle, a form, a source of inspiration, and a condition of our time, we in the archives business find the documentary turn in contemporary art and critical thinking to be infinitely fascinating. From our perspective, the creator of a collection of personal papers attempts to fix his or her identity through the accumulation and selection of letters, notes and writings, sales receipts, random lists, and photographs that will become the paper remnant and a public record of their life preserved in perpetuity. Scholars consulting these primary sources are as interested in what's not there as what is. The documentation with its partial truths, as well as the absence of evidence, fuels the endless speculation that is the stuff of art history. Today's program turns on how artists use, reimagine, and respond to archives as source material, as collective history or private memory, or as an artistic medium through discovering, documenting, recording, and classifying. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Sven Spieker. Sven teaches in the Comparative Literature Program, the Department of Art and Art History, and the Department of Germanic, Slavic, and Semitic Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He specializes in European modernism with an emphasis on Eastern European avant-gardes, contemporary art with an emphasis on Eastern Europe, and critical theory. Spieker has published on topics ranging from the Russian avant-garde to late 20th century art and aesthetics. His essays and articles have appeared in German, Russian, Swedish, Polish, and English. Spieker has organized several international conferences, most recently the Office in the Studio, the Administration of Modernism at the University of Jena, Germany. Spieker's latest book, publication, focused on the archive as a crucible of European modernism, and the book is The Big Archive. It's published by MIT Press in 2008. Spieker is the editor of Art Margins and Art Margins Online. Please welcome him.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Many thanks to the organizers, and I'm very proud to be part of Pacific Standard Time. My presentation today is titled Unknowing, Getting Lost, Linking Points in Space, the New Archival Practice. And there's a little motto, a little epigraph by the Swiss artist Thomas Hirschhorn. It goes as follows: "To connect what cannot be connected, that's exactly what my work as an artist is." Romanian artist Lia Pediovshi's installation Knowledge Museum, which consists of combinations of drawings, objects, charts, photos, and color prints across several rooms, is based on the contemporary art archive that she and her husband Dan founded in Bucharest in the early 1990s. Based on the idea of producing and sharing knowledge, Pediovshi's Knowledge Museum is, among other things, a reflection on the repressive conditions of pre-1990 Romania, when even the exchange of books was considered a suspicious activity. As art historian and curator Natasha Petreshin-Bacheles has commented, quote, "Characterized by an interdisciplinary approach, this future artist-run museum is dedicated to moving away from the logic of the exhibition as spectacle and towards a learning process of working with an open structured archive," unquote. And here are two more views of this future knowledge museum. So this by way of a preamble. If it makes sense to speak about the archive in today's art practice, it will be useful, I think, to view the archive not as a repository of stagnant facts, but as some kind of a relay station on the global trajectory along which documents travel, where they are exchanged, transmitted, remediated, and where new uses and meanings, or combinations of the two, are tested and in turn exchanged. We know that in such a scenario, archives are not and never have been the neutral arbiters of our traffic with documents. In an archive, as Alan Sikula and others have found, the meaning of documents is always up for grabs, as its past uses coexist with future possibilities. Or, to be more precise, what is up for grabs and open to renegotiation is the relationship between a document's past and present meanings on the one hand, and its present uses on the other. Where historicism interprets archival documents vertically, collapsing the difference between space and time by treating relations in space as if they were relations in time, what I call today's new archival practice relates documents as equivalent points on a horizontal plane, and that is the archive that Sikula has called a territory of images, connecting and concatenating these points in ways that privileges process and that is committed to present possibilities as a way of anticipating a different future as a form of contemporaneity. Archives are not redemptive. They do not redeem the past. But they may suggest different outcomes, turning, as art historian Hal Foster has written, belatedness into becomingness. Or, as the members of the Delhi-based Rars Media Collective have commented, to quote them, just as the painstaking reconstruction of an archive of lost and scattered meanings is one of the first cultural tasks on the agenda of the insurgent, a critical engagement with a documentary mode of practice, too, becomes, for the same reason, one of the key undertakings of the contemporary art practitioner who seeks to express contemporaneity as much as he or she engages with art, unquote. What I want to call the practice of the archive is insufficiently theorized if we describe it in the terms of a treasure hunt. What we find in an archive has always traveled there from some more or less defined place or region. And it is the more or less precarious, often imaginative construction of its trajectories that defines the work of the documentary practitioner. Archival practice is not the retrieval of memories understood as the rediscovery of what once was. It is rather the refusal to think of remembrance in terms that collapse space and time, again, the space of the archive translated into the depth of history, and that understand memory as an endeavor to connect against the demands of chronological sequence, medium specificity, or geographical reason, different practical ways of doing and knowing, or rather, of doing as a form of knowing. In the 1980s and 90s, the archive was often conceptualized as a more or less random repository of objects, whose unifying principle was the fact that we cannot fathom its dimensions. The key to this romantic archive was the suspicion that its true dimensions, the extent of the archive's knowledge, cannot reliably be determined. The archive always knows infinitely more than we do, but we do not know how much more exactly. That the archive is at least potentially endless, and that for that reason we cannot adopt an adequate position either within it or outside it, was axiomatic for its practitioners. And I want to show you just a few examples. There's Hanne Darboven in a remarkable installation called Stone of Wisdom. There is Christian Boltanski, perhaps the most prominent example of this type of what I call romantic archive, in a work from 1987. And there is finally Ilya Kabakov's Big Archive, an installation. The romantic archive was particularly popular in the countries of the former Eastern Bloc, so it's just as well that I stop with Kabakov here. In the former Eastern Bloc, where artists operated in an archival mode as a way of responding to the omnipresent surveillance tools of the totalitarian state, of which the archive was one, and as a way of compensating for the lack of access to museums and galleries. Pessimistic regarding the possibility of establishing viable meta-positions from which that totalitarian system might effectively be criticized, Eastern European artists, among them Kabakov, during the period of the Cold War, set up their own archival operations, sometimes, as in Kabakov's case, with an equal aspiration to function in a totalitarian way and to analyze in this way the critical relationship between knowledge and power. If today the archive functions no longer as a figure of romantic infinity or as a compensatory device, then what is its function and politics? How close can we come to describing its parameters and ways of doing? How does today's new archival practice, developed under conditions that differ in crucial ways from the postmodernism of the 1990s, distinguish itself not only from the romantic archive, but also from what followed it, the what you might call nomadic archival forms that were developed, for example, by Alan Sekula in a famous work called Fish Story. Sekula spent several weeks on a large cargo ship mapping the material conditions that made economic globalization possible. The resulting archive that is Fish Story, and which has seen several different incarnations in both museum installations and as a book, focuses on the openness of the sea and its influence on commerce and art, the questioning of horizons, and the disorienting effects this has on models of visuality that are based on stable vantage points. And I'm just showing you, and this is somewhat incongruous, a few of the photographs that Sekula produced as a result of these voyages. In the book, they appear together with a number of textual documents. The sea for Sekula functions as a foil, and I have so there's an example of a textual document that is part of this archive, and otherwise a few examples. The sea for Sekula in Fish Story functions as a foil before which the question of the politics of global capital and its flows poses itself also as a question of aesthetics. Now, as a practice of the archive and as a form of knowledge production, Sekula's Fish Story is much closer, and I want to do a little bit of a historical contextualization here. Fish Story is much closer to the critical realism of the late 1920s, with figures such as Sergei Tretyakov, Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, than to the aesthetics of collage and photomontage that dominated the early 1920s. Where early 1920s Dada collage montages the fragmentary debris of an alienated and alienating reality, enlisting shock as a way of reproducing in art the subject's inability or unwillingness to assimilate, in the late 1920s, leaving the period from which this Schwitters example is taken, in the late 1920s, the question of public agitation and a new form of realism, especially in photography, was asked with renewed urgency. As one of the theoreticians of Soviet factography from the late 1920s, Sergei Tretyakov wrote, to quote him, "Today, it's utterly inconceivable how we could get by without the photographer who takes pictures of the 5-year plan, who takes pictures of the launch and growth of our industrial giants, and thereby carries out a great and authentic agitation through display." Unquote. So moving away from this aesthetic of shock, and I will see how this will feed into today's archival practice in a moment. Now, it was less a matter of formal rupture when Sergei Tretyakov wrote these lines than of documenting, by way of a dialectical juxtaposition, a qualitative leap in technical and hence human development. The logic of these concatenations and combinations of documentary images that Tretyakov is advocating in the late 1920s is archival in a way that's fundamentally different from the earlier aesthetics of collage and photomontage. Its focus is marvel and surprise rather than shock. And I'm quoting Tretyakov one last time. The juxtaposition, for example, of a photograph of a tiny village on a putrid little river with one taken a year later in which a glass building has replaced the village, such stunning juxtapositions force you to radically reconsider the obsolete notion of a human lifetime. For our century equals a millennium in earlier times. Unquote. The newly affirmative aesthetics of an activist form of knowledge production developed in the late 1920s, with its retooling of the artist as a producer of facts and an engineer at the service of organization, provides, I think, a crucial reference point for anyone interested in the new archival practice of the first decade of the 21st century. As members of the St. Petersburg-based artist collective Stur Djelich have recently commented, to quote them, "Striving to be realists in the authentic, broad sense of the word, we once again repeat Lenin's half-forgotten thesis. You can become a communist only when you have enriched your memory with knowledge of all the riches that humanity has created." Unquote. Crucially, such knowledge must not be confused with positivism or with a universal form of pedagogy. The group Studielec, for example, uses the traditional, even reactionary form of the Singspiel or the Songspiel, as in Mozart's Magic Flute, which Mozart himself called a Singspiel, in a way that correlates with Bertolt Brecht's renovation of the equally reactionary opera. The Songspiel's stylization and obvious detachment from reality became, for the artists of Studielec, the only way to counteract the co-option of their art activism by a contemporary art world enthralled with all things documentary. In a sense, the equally reactionary institution of the archive fulfills a similar function. It, too, represents an effort to deal with critical information from within the art world and in an effort to oppose a realism that cancels its medium by another, for which the question as to who is speaking and from which position remains virulent throughout. The current discussion of knowledge production in art often deploys the archive of all institutions as a liberating countermodel to the school, which it associates with repressive forms of hegemonic knowledge. At a recent conference at London's Hayward Gallery that took its title from a once famous book, namely Ivan Illich's 1970s Deschooling Society. So this conference at London's Hayward Gallery, for example, implied a strong opposition to Jürgen Habermas' project of universal learning and more generally to universal abstract forms of knowledge. And by the way, I couldn't help but quote one passage from this remarkable book, which is quite amazing, and I want to read it here briefly. Illich writes, "I recently spoke to a group of junior high school students in the process of organizing a resistance movement to their obligatory draft into the next class. Their slogan was participation, not simulation. They were disappointed that this was understood as a demand for less rather than more education." So, but my point is that it is interesting to see that the archive is often sort of deployed as a countermodel to hegemonic institutional knowledge represented by the school or the university. And so at the 2011 Folkestone Triennial, Israeli artist Smadar Dreyfus showed an interesting project that was entitled School. It occupied an entire floor, and the installation immersed the visitor in edited audio recordings of 7 lessons and a school break from several mainstream schools in central Israel. And among the subjects covered were history, geography, biology, Arabic, Bible studies, citizenship, and literature. And I want to demonstrate briefly what this sounds like. That's enough. So while he was omitting any visual recordings of the lessons, Dreyfus replaced the institutionally channeled transmission of grand narratives involving history, identity, and nation that is typical of schools all over the world with a more archival mode that allows for the production rather than the mere transmission of knowledge by reshuffling and combining sound, voices, and pieces of fragmentary information in new and often startling ways. Here's one of the visuals produced for this installation. In the introduction to a recently published edited volume entitled Beyond the Archive, Research as a Lived Process, we read that the volume, quote, wants to mark the change from reading an archive not just as a source but also as a subject. That is, the authors understand archives not as things but as epistemological experiments, not as sites for knowledge retrieval but rather as sites for knowledge production, unquote. The same, I think, might be argued for the new archival practice as well. Of course, the relationship between art and knowledge production exceeds institutional concerns, as in the question, what is art research and does it deserve a PhD? And it goes beyond the question after the relationship between art and aesthetics that so passionately divides contemporary thinkers such as Jacques Rancière and Alain Badiou. Crucially, the problem of knowledge, its generation and distribution, is not just a problem for art, it is also a problem in art. The artist as archivist is today less an administrator, a bureaucrat, or an ethnographer than a kind of knowledge worker under the real or imagined conditions of post-Fordism. His or her wager is that the archive is not an institution in the classical sense of the word, but a form of distributed global knowledge, the entirety of pathways, channels, sites, and locations along which images and texts travel, and the practices to which they connect. Study in the archive is no longer the archaeological uncovering of the various layers that define the present, that define the present invisibly, as always already divided from itself. Nor is it only the post-colonial reappropriation of the colonial archive by those who contest its power to police the boundary between selfhood and otherness. Nor, finally, is the archive's purchase today tied only to the postmodern affirmation of difference and differential identity in the face of the ever-expanding hegemony of liberal capitalism. If for Michel Foucault archives are the condition under which statements can be experienced as real, then perhaps today the archive may be called the condition under which statements or events can be experienced as possible. The historical point for such an assertion would be not the early 20th century montage that I already mentioned with its assumption of break and rupture, but rather the concatenation of different ways of doing that Jacques Rancière includes in what he calls the redistribution of the sensible. For Rancière, archives are a form of inventory that designates, to quote him, it's a bit of a complicated quote, but I think it's very useful in this context, the potential of objects and images in terms of common history and the kinship between inventive acts of art and the multiplicity of inventions of the arts of doing and living that make up a shared world. And he mentions as examples bricolage, collections, language games, materials for demonstrations, etc., unquote. Rancière goes on to argue that, to quote him again, in the space reserved for art, the artist strives to render visible the arts of doing which exist scattered throughout society, unquote. The archive then allows us to think knowledge not as a problem for epistemology or representation, or of the break with knowledge and representation, but rather of the continuity of knowledge as a form of practice. Allow me to illustrate what I mean. Beirut-based artist Akram Zaatari's film One Day from 2003 is an experimental work about the artist's trip through various parts of the Middle East. It draws on material from many archives, from Zaatari's snapshots of the invasion of Lebanon by the Israeli military to a volume about the Bedouins from the early 20th century that is illustrated by many historical photographs. However, One Day is not a documentary. Instead of using the many archival images and documents, that is both visual and audio ones, that appear in this film as objectifying sources of knowledge, Zaatari subjects these materials, or their observers, to a radically destabilizing, disorienting force. Sometimes that force is the camera itself, as it scans the surface of a photograph in such a way that it loses its coherence. And I want to show you that.
بعد بسرعة صوت البتراء 12 تلميذ قلت هذه صوت جنى أول وبعدين كوثر وبعدين عفيفة لا
either clay jars or tenor.
So it's a commentary on a historical photograph that goes into this volume about the Bedouins.
Dressed in long, typical dresses, with headdress as well. Their hair is covered. Their shadows are perfect, and it is early morning.
That's enough. Thank you.
Though perfectly symmetrical in the middle of
So the quality of this image as an integrated image is shattered, and instead in this scanning process, it refracts into a series of motions that preclude easy orientation. It is as if Zaatari has to unknow the document before he can summon it to testify. More often than not, the force of disorientation in this video, and I think this is sort of a general thing we can say about this new archival practice, the force of disorientation in one day is a force we call speed, which also, not coincidentally in the context of the Middle East, is the defining force in any war. I want to show you a few examples of how speed affects documentation in one day, but briefly before that, I want to give a quick quote that illustrates my point. So an art historian by the name of Hannah Feldman wrote an extremely interesting article about this film one day, and she writes that, quote, Zaatari's personal archive of snapshots of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon resulted from his determination to photograph the daily landing of civilian planes at Beirut airport. And Feldman goes on to argue that this obsessive will to document the signs of normalized movement, indeed the very will to give movement speed, the quality of narration to static images, makes sense only in relation to the artist's attempt to dislodge the spectacular grip of the 1982 pictures with those that indicate peace and normalcy. Yeah? So there's this idea that somehow Zaatari, whose film is full of speeded up images that are very difficult to observe because they flicker by so fast, was in fact looking for normal speed in some sense. But the problem seems to be that it is impossible in this film to settle for a normal pace, a kind of 0 degree of knowledge and understanding, as any documentary practice establishes or imposes its own speed. That is already in evidence when at the very beginning of the film, Zaatari, his hands covered by gloves, flips through an archive of historical photographs taken in the 1950s by the assistant of the person who wrote that book I mentioned at the onset. We see him basically with his fingers flip through a box of single photographs, the very photographs that are the basis of this scene that we just saw. So this is a scene in which we see him flip through these images in a rather sort of slow way. And there is also the slow speed of the camels that populate the desert. In another scene, we can go to that, 45. 47.5. Preceded by an image of war, a granular kind of warplane. And then we have here Zaatari's personal photo album, which he also shows. By contrast, when the artist films the road and landscape outside the window of his moving SUV when he drives through the desert, the landscape completely flattens and gets blurred, haunted by the flat gray figures from the volume about the Bedouins. So here's an example, a counterexample, where suddenly the film speeds up, as you will see in a moment, and where you get a kind of strange flickering effect.
He believes that Arabic culture stems from the Bedouin life, and that they are linked to understanding something that is vanishing, the sources of this culture. Because as they vanish, then also will the understanding. You have a living lens to look at what the sources of such a culture is. And they are what remains of the Bedouins. And their ways.
That's enough, thank you. So I'm very interested to sum this up in the different speeds at which the film looks at documents here. And in the last bit, of course, you could see that photographs from the historical volume about the history of the Bedouins that I mentioned at the onset, in fact, appear Fata Morgana-like, ghost-like in this speedy scene. So we could be witnessing a Fata Morgana, or perhaps such haunting is the general condition of the archive once it has been freed from the constraints of representation. Both the images and their observers are in motion at different speeds, and the effects thus created exceed any truth we might expect an archive to perform. Crucially, the archive in this film One Day is not the horizon for these speed-induced distortions. It is not the condition that allows us to experience the documents used in the film as real, or to translate them from a state of latency or potentiality into positive knowledge. The documentary images do not exist as such. They exist as series of aggregate states, fast, slow, clear, blurred, etc., that prevent them from ever being self-same. They cannot be translated, or rather, they can only be translated. At one time, a female voiceover in the film that provides an academic commentary on an old photograph, again from the volume about the Bedouins, moves back and forth seamlessly between English and Arabic, as if to suggest that the archive is not the condition of translatability, but rather it is the space where translation occurs or does not occur. While at times the caption provided by the female voice is perfectly clear and academically transparent, at others, in the Arabic passages, it ceases to make sense for non-Arabic speakers. Or rather, it does make sense, but that sense does not travel through language's expressive function, as if to say that the practice of knowledge production is not here tied to such transparency. Things can happen even in the absence of translation. Now, the paths traveled by Zaatari, both in the real landscape of the Middle East and as he scans the surface of historical photographs and documents, does not serve the goal of orientation and a regulated transfer from one point to another. Rather, the film aligns different practices and documentary actions in such a way that they produce what we might call openings, pathways that provide the space for the redistribution of the sensible, a sense of possibility. Zaatari believes that his archival practice is not involved in the reconstruction of the past, but in what he calls a potential history of Gaza based on possible rather than objective facts. Homi Bhabha has recently compared archives to the road not taken. I think the comparison is apt, and it captures the spirit of Zaatari's project. Thought of not as a tool of memory, but as an active practice of remembrance that joins the fragments of many worlds in an open-ended process, archives tell us about the present, yet at the same time, they may also offer momentary glimpses of a future yet to come. Disorientation and unknowing, as well as an associative linking of archival documents that looks on the archive as the site of a practice whose goal is to open up space for knowing, are also key elements in Stockholm-based Lina Selander's Around the Cave of the Double Tombs, a video and a book project that deal with the artist's multiple visits to the West Bank city of Hebron. Around the Cave of the Double Tombs takes its starting point in several research trips to the West Bank, especially to the city of Hebron, and the mute video that I want to show you a brief excerpt from links photographs and still images that show a model of ancient Jerusalem into a museum, a checkpoint with its massive security architecture, but also houses, walls, objects, and all kinds of other things. In a style at times vaguely reminiscent of early 20th century montage film, and in contemporary art, similar to the work of somebody like Emilia Zier, Seelander creates an archive that is suspended between motion and frozen inertia, and that is why I insert her here next to Zaatari. So here's a brief sequence. This is a video without sound. 320, 320. So the following scenes show the border fence, essentially. Although they don't, I mean. So just maybe a couple of words about her working process, which seems to me so remarkably close to Zaatari's and so full of allusions to, perhaps more generally speaking, archival practice today, that I think it's worth dwelling on. For Seelander, it is during the process of editing when, to paraphrase another artist, Harun Farocki, she takes leave of any plans she may have had for her material and realizes that such planning is, in her words, nonsense. Driving across her own material, much like Zaatari drifts across the Syrian desert, Seelander creates local orders without an overarching master plan. And I think that was clear even from this scene, which leaves you without a sense that you really are able to, as it were, survey the terrain within which this fence is located, and that she is herself, as it were, excluded from it, a process not unlike the disorienting unknowing practiced by Zaatari, providing a vivid illustration of the multiple alienation of the artist as producer in this case. The document for Seelander functions as a screen memory. Its purpose is to hide, not to reveal. It is up to the traveling, strolling, lost artist to find what it hides. The problem of work with documents as a way of opening up a space for what is possible, rather than what is real, often begins paradoxically with the foreclosure of knowledge. And I want to give another example of that. Jorgen Gazilewski's 2006 novel, The Gothenburg Events, uses a multitude of painstakingly collected and researched documents to reconstruct George W. Bush's 2001 visit to the Swedish port city of Gothenburg on the occasion of the EU summit meeting. By combining documents with elements of fiction, Gazilewski's novel provides a literary, yet also oddly documentary, elaboration of the demonstrations and police violence that accompanied the summit, as well as its judicial aftermath. For Gazilewski, literature is a way of, to quote him, uncovering the implicit narrative constraint of a document, unquote. By this, the writer means that an archival document does not contain or own its own status as an index or trace. Rather, it searches for that status within what the author calls the greatest of stories, reality. Calling his novel a literal fiction, big difference, a literal fiction, Gazilewski focuses on the figure of an alleged German agent provocateur with yellow hair who figures in the internal police reports of the Swedish police and subsequently in the right-wing Swedish press as an anarchist and German terrorist. The true identity of this German, whose alleged subversive activities the press soon utilized to refer to all the demonstrators as terrorists and whose testimony was used in court against the demonstrators, could never be established. He was most likely an invention by the police. In Gazilewski's novel, by contrast, which is based on documents, the figure of the German terrorist becomes a real, i.e. fictional character. As such, the German terrorist in the novel The Gothenburg Events is the counterpart to the ghosts that haunt the archive in Zaatari's One Day. As we saw, Zaatari continuously creates effects of disorientation and archival misprison that create openings in the archive for what is possible rather than what is factual or real. Gazilewski, too, challenges our idea of a stable boundary between the document and literature, between the archive and the real, and between art practice, writing, and politics. Just like the police archive documents the existence of an agent provocateur who was in all likelihood fictitious, Gazilewski, by placing this fictional character within the limits of his documentary novel, not only discredits the police archive as a fiction, he also establishes his novel, The Gothenburg Events, as the only possible documentary practice, since it alone is capable of unveiling the narrative constraint that inhibits the police archive, meshed up as it is in relations of power, from functioning as an index of what really happened. Now, the kind of interrogation of documents carried out by Gazilevsky and other artists is crucial to the knowledge production I refer to as the new archival practice. As I mentioned, at the heart of this archive is less the reification of knowledge or the suggestion that knowledge is emancipatory in and of itself, than its subsumption under various regimes of practice. Such knowledge practice views the archive as an inventory in Rancière's sense, as, to quote again, the potential of objects and images in terms of a common history. The defining feature of the archive as a space for the production of knowledge is that it blurs the line between practice and theory, between art and action, creating various forms of disorientation, for which Zaatari's film and Sikula's fish story were emblematic. We have to forget to identify the narrative constraint if we want documents not only to signify what happened, a hopeless undertaking, but what could happen. I want to end my lecture with a brief consideration of the way in which aspects of the new archival practice play out in the area of recent curatorship. Here, so-called research exhibitions enlist the archive in an effort to wrest exhibitions away from the authority of historical narrative towards a contestatory practice that views exhibitions, somewhat optimistically, as a form of activism. So one example would be, I have two examples, and depending on how much time I have left, I will maybe only use one. So one example for this that particularly is interesting in that it highlights what I have referred to as disorientation as a crucial way of dealing with archives in the context of contemporary art. So disorientation as a form of productive misprison was the goal behind a recent show in Belgrade, whose curatorial concepts the organizers aptly described as partisan. And of course, that's a rich word in the context of the former Yugoslavia. So I'm referring to an exhibition that happened in 2009, and that was called Political Practices of Post-Yugoslav Art, Retrospective 01. Some images that show that exhibition. The express goal of this partisan exhibition, this is a term coined by curator Jelena Vesic, which began as a research project initiated by 4 independent organizations, was to develop a counterposition to dominant perspectives on art and culture in socialist Yugoslavia, be these positions nostalgic for communism or conversely locked into the binary Cold War dialectic. At the core of the show, or of the show's curatorial plan, as distinct from the way in which that program was actually translated into practice, was the redefinition of the exhibition as a site not for the reproduction of existing normative histories, but for the production of alternatives to them. And one of the key decisions taken by the curators to make this possible was to exhibit not art, but only documents that documented that art, so that the show would in effect function like an archive rather than an art exhibition. According to the organizers, one of the advantages of this approach was its more flexible tactical nature, but also its demonstrative, instructional character. And the documents in that sense were exhibited as demonstration materials rather than as art, and this was thought to naturally lead to experimentation, to a more experimental approach. Political practices of post-Yugoslav art, we might say, is curatorship in the age of deschooling. Here's a page from the catalog. The abolishment of the instructional side of curating, exhibitions as a history lesson, here leads not to less, but to more education. The knowledge generated by the exhibition is not there to be contemplated, it is there to be actively assimilated and evaluated with a view to its usefulness for, in the curator's own terms, changing the present. Or to be more precise, it is there to be demonstrated, which should here be understood in its double sense as an experimental scientific demonstration and as a political manifestation. The function of the exhibition is, in the curator's own words, not some total and all-encompassing historical overview. On the contrary, its goal is self-educational in the sense of presenting some models for independent research, for the actual purpose of studying the genealogies of political practices of art, which can provide a different perspective for positioning and acting within the contemporary situation, unquote. The new archival practice of the last decade that I've tried to outline retools the archive as a means to foreground knowledge as an operation, an object of exchange and an open possibility. This knowledge aesthetic, which the French curator Nicolas Bourriot once rather clumsily compared to an iTunes playlist, uses the archive, a deliberately reactionary or outmoded medium, in order to reach a new form of documentary realism and a reconfiguration of the relationship between political activism and art. It is important to realize that as such, the new archival practice includes a revisiting, if not a revision, of the archival politics of the 1920s that I hinted at, and their various articulations of the relationship between art and politics. The archive, in my reading, redistributes the sensible by focusing not on the past, but on present ways of doing. Yet, like the archive itself, that practice has an open ending, oscillating as it does between the articulation of knowledge and its disorienting disarticulation between the present and an open future. The archive is a laboratory of meanings and uses. Thank you.
Oh, I was just wondering if we could access what you were just reading.
You mean
anywhere?
The artist materials or my talk?
No, what you were saying, the talk.
You can email me.
Okay.
I'll give you my address.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about narrative. If you could speak more directly to what you think the place of narrative is in contemporary archival practice. And you're talking about sort of revisionism of the 20s and 30s archival practice. And my thought is that obviously early modernism is about disnarrativity, the refusal to narratize art, and the rejection of representation, the move towards abstraction. So I'm just wondering, but I don't see any sort of return of the author in any conventional way in the works that you showed and discussed here. But I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more directly to the role of narrative in contemporary archival practice.
I mean, it's incredibly hard to generalize. It's such an important question, and based on the material that I've presented, you would maybe come to a different conclusion if you focused on different material. I mean, my overall sense is that it's important to see what happens today, maybe within a certain tension created between what you alluded to, that is a kind of early 20th century onslaught against representation, and an early 1920s disruption of narrative, of coherent representation, and focusing on that. And then the kind of often somewhat misrepresented return to narrative and realism and so on in the late 1920s. I mean, this was kind of the framework that I wanted to use to say, well, it appears as if many of the artists that work archivally, if that's really a good term for it, situate themselves in a very deliberate way within that tension. I don't think that they want to be seen as iconoclasts, as disruptors of representation who simply return to the aesthetics of montage or collage, but at the same time who don't want to be simply identified, with the return to perhaps what's sometimes referred to the archival aesthetic of the late 1920s either. Yeah. So in the case of somebody like Lina Seelander, I think she's extremely interested in narrative, but she finds it locally. Yeah? She creates local narratives that she finds, or that find her, whichever way she puts this, and she lets them sort of sit and play themselves out. Yeah? So my sense is that it's about connecting narratives rather than finding a big meta-narrative with most of these artists. So So far, so confused. Any other?
So I was really struck by your choice of examples. It seemed very kind of pointedly took its choices from outside Western Europe and the United States in terms of talking about these contemporary practices. And I was just wondering if maybe you could relate the artists that you did speak about to what you see happening, in the U.S. context, for instance, and kind of like how the relationship between these practices and what kind of practices are being developed in, here, for instance.
It's incredibly difficult because it's so hard today to divide up the world into these clear-cut spaces. You have these artists operate in all these different contexts, and even though it's true that some of the work that I showed is focused maybe on Eastern Europe, that's purely a personal choice that has to do with my own interest in that area, or maybe with the Middle East. It seems to me in terms of, and I mean, the last thing I wanted to suggest was that there was sort of a global archival practice that's simply the same everywhere, right? But at the same time, it's very difficult to carve up the world today, let's say, into ways of doing in the US and then ways of doing in the Middle East. I mean, there is obviously such a high degree of interaction and collaboration and participation that becomes extremely difficult. The biggest problem with a concept like the archive is precisely in a way that it seems that its reach has become so global, so powerful, so all pervasive that there's really perhaps a danger of universalizing the term in ways that are not always helpful. Yeah, but it is of course a product of a certain of the way in which it has made its entry into the global art world, yeah, where it has its own history, and sometimes a history that's contested by people who work in archives and so on. But anyway, it's a good but very difficult question to answer, I think.
I just actually wanted to follow up on, Sven, what you just said, because I was struck by your use of the term "the archive," and then I just wanted to know, is there any definition of that you use just functionally? Because for me, as you just indicated, I sometimes worry that this is one of those terms that gets so big that it can include any type of accumulation and collecting and display. So because you've written on this, is there some kind of functional or useful definition that you would have for us to specify what it is when we're talking about the archive?
I mean, many. My first sort of reflexive response would be to defer to the archivists among us. Of course, there are technical definitions of the archive, and in fact, in this book that was mentioned at the beginning, I was still quite obsessed with the idea of relating a more technical definition of archival operations to the way in which archives function in the art world. And now I'm discovering that that's a hopeless undertaking, because artists will call archives whatever they want. And I have participated in, because you become associated with a term like this, and so since the term can not die, it seems, in art, there are many symposia and conferences and so on devoted to it. And it's very interesting that you always have these discussions or these arguments between artists and art historians or archive theorists. And so the artists will say, oh, my work that I just showed you, a bunch of photographs or a bunch of letters or whatever it is, was an archive. And then, someone will say, well, that's not an archive, that's a collection. And then the artist will say, what do you mean? Of course it's an archive. And so it becomes, I want to come back to what I said before. It seems to me that the term has its own history already in the discourse of art. And I guess one simply has to accept that. So I've given up trying to somehow, discipline the usage of the term, and I simply accept it perhaps more, and sometimes, I mean, I'm absolutely sympathetic to your point. One has to be very careful not to void it of any specific meaning, but I'm not sure that this is necessarily incompatible. In other words, not to insist on one definition of the archive, and at the same time not to say that it's simply random. I believe there is a middle ground, and I guess that's what my talk was trying to establish, was precisely that middle ground, if that makes sense.
I think another question about the archive, though, that perhaps helps to define it, is that an archive has a kind of authority as a source, as this is the history. And John and I were showing the Duchamp green box to students, and those scraps of information about his larger work were put together in a way to describe or to give the background, perhaps by him and perhaps not, entirely truthfully, but perhaps fictitiously. But I think that the archive has this status as an authoritative source, and perhaps also that helps give it a kind of partisan or political, to use the same word, authority or status. Would you like to comment a little bit on that?
Well, short of saying that, of course, I agree with you, and I think, it certainly does have that authority, whichever way you want to define that authority, though. I mean, I don't know if it's the archive itself or it's the uses to which the archive is put that bestow it with such authority in sometimes good and in sometimes bad ways. Yeah, I mean, I think many artists today are precisely interested in investigating where that authority comes from, who makes it, that this authority is not something that somehow lives in archives, but that it's something that's given to archives, and that it's part of a whole web of relationships within which archives exist, among them contemporary art, let's say. So I think what you say is extremely important, but shouldn't be taken as a given. Again, the authority of the archive is not a natural given. It is the result of relationships and culture and power, frankly. And I think many of the artists, go work with archival material precisely because they're interested in these relationships.
My question will follow on the...
I cannot see you.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
My question's gonna follow up after the couple last question. It has to do with the political effectiveness of such endeavors. If we think that in the 70s artists started to use a sort of archive aesthetic or activist aesthetic borrowed from the social and political movement of their times, and that nowadays we might assist to a reverse process, artists feeling the need to come back to a more activist or politically concerned practice, which would borrow from the aesthetic of the archive in order to feel more politically active. I was thinking, what would be your point of view? If you think that such endeavors are really changing and challenging representations, especially in the actual context, as one of the previous questions was underlining, and if at your knowledge, especially as you were saying, you're specialized, you've been interested into the Eastern Europe endeavor in art in the 2000s, using these means to try to understand its own historical process and stuff. Do you think it's effective, or it's maybe, on the contrary, a growing cessation from the artistic world, which would definitely among ourselves re-observe endlessly circles and redoing history in our private corner, and finally not having any impact on the outside world? What would be your opinion about this? Do you think it really changes something, or is it just children playing in their room, replaying the Indian Cowboys War or something?
Maybe both. I mean, certainly I'm really grateful for your question in the sense that it really it demonstrates or reminds us that there are places in the world where archives are eminently political. I mean, and Eastern Europe is one, South America is another, and maybe at times not just there, but in other places too. I've heard many art historians from South America talk about the need to take the archives back, particularly artist archives that were misappropriated, repressed, and so forth. So, the possession of archives, the administration of archives, the accessibility of archives, I mean, those are all eminently political important questions, and they're not at all, just sort of art chatter. Otherwise, beyond that, in the way in which maybe the archive functions in the work of the artists I mentioned here, I would say that's, in a sense, the question that interests me most is sort of on a conceptual level, how is it that the archive has come to be, of all institutions, is today associated with a kind of progressive political agenda? How and why does that happen? And how seriously are we to take it? I mean, I really, like your question. And I guess my response in a way would be maybe to also avoid the sort of talk about the archive becoming more and more amorphous, was to focus as much on the archive as on this question of knowledge. I mean, I'm very interested in the way in which knowledge today too is politicized. Yeah, that is to say research, the production of research, art research, knowledge in art and so on. These are all incredibly hot topics, it seems, in the art world today, and they're inevitably linked to questions of political emancipation, activism, and so on. And it's curious. I mean, for the longest time, you mentioned the 70s. Knowledge was attacked as being repressive, and the institutions that produced it as being even more repressive. So I'm very curious about the changed relationship that we have to the production of knowledge, let's say, and the way in which the archive figures in that constellation. And I believe that today the archive is still a topic that people discuss, not because of the 1990s, but because of this question of knowledge. I think it's a really important issue today for many artists, and not just artists, but also educators in art and so on. And the archive today, I think, is really linked to a different set of issues and priorities than in earlier decades. And these are political, yeah. I don't want to decide how real this is. We'll see. Yeah, but I mean, if you study maybe some of these exhibitions and their claims and you hold them against what you see, I mean, you get a sense of how real this might be or might not be. I mean, there have been, well-known controversies about the Istanbul Biennale and so on. So we know about this, that there can be a big discrepancy between the political ambition and the reality on the ground. Yeah, so, so I'm aware of those, but probably it's too early to make up our minds about it, but it's an excellent question, I think.
One last quick question.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to follow up on some of that, actually, because I completely agree with your response just then. But I wanted to think back to the 70s and possibly early 80s, maybe before the Romantic archive that you described, and just think about the way in which artists actually got together to actually form archives rather than making work about them. And I was thinking about, for instance, a women's artists archive that I was involved in, or the black artists archives that came up and were emerging in London, certainly in the early to mid 80s and so on. And I wanted to see that as a different form of artistic production, anticipating some of the things that you followed with.
I mean, incredibly important precedents for this topic, yeah, for what I mentioned before. Yeah, so I mean, one could not possibly write the history of the politicization of the archive without mentioning these precedents. Absolutely.
Thank you, Sven.
Thank you.
So we're going to break now for a 15-minute coffee break. We are going to start promptly in 15 minutes, so please don't dally.